For centuries, the beast from the book of Revelation has been one of the most mysterious and debated figures in history. I mean, who is it? What does it represent? Well, today, we're going to unpack one very specific, very detailed interpretation from our source material that pieces together history and prophecy to try and identify this enigmatic figure. Okay, let's dive right in.
So let's start with the big question. The book of Revelation talks about this incredibly powerful entity, the beast, that rises to power in the end times. But is it a system, a symbol, or is it an actual person? The interpretation we're exploring today argues it's very much a real, identifiable individual.
So here's our roadmap for today. We're going to start by defining the beast as this end times figure, and then look at a historical prototype that kind of sets the pattern. After that, we'll explore the future empire he's supposed to come from, detail his final reign, and then wrap up with why this whole prophecy is seen as such a critical warning. Now, the interpretation we're digging into is super clear on this point. The beast isn't just some metaphor for evil. No, it refers to a specific future world leader who is going to completely dominate the global stage right before the end of the age. This is the figure that a lot of theologians would flat out call the Antichrist. You know, it's pretty understandable that throughout history, people have pointed fingers at leaders of their day, claiming they were the Antichrist. But according to this view, that's a huge mistake. Whether it's a pope or a president, just focusing on who's in power right now without the specific prophetic framework can lead you way off track. Okay, so if you can't just point at a current leader, how do you identify him? Well, this interpretation really hinges on this key piece of scripture. This verse is seen as a three-part key to unlocking the beast's identity. It mentions a form that was, a time when it is not, and then a final version that is about to rise. Let's break down exactly what that means. We'll start with that first part, the beast that was. Now, this doesn't mean the final Antichrist has already lived and died. Nope. Instead, this viewpoint says it refers to a historical figure who acted as a perfect template, or you could say a prototype, for what the future beast is going to be like. And this whole concept of a prototype figure is absolutely central to this interpretation. It's basically someone from history whose life and actions create a pattern, like a blueprint. The idea is, if we can study this historical pattern, we'll be able to recognize the real thing when he finally shows up in the future. So who is this prototype? Well, according to this interpretation, the answer is tucked away back in the Old Testament, in the book of Daniel. The prophecy there talks about a figure called the Little Horn. And no, this isn't some mythical creature. It's actually a title for a very real and very, very ruthless historical king. And here is where the pattern just becomes crystal clear. This interpretation identifies that little horn as Antiochus IV, a Greek king who ruled out of Syria. I mean, just look at the parallels here. He invaded Jerusalem, he viciously persecuted the Jewish people, he desecrated their holy temple. The argument is that the future beast will follow this exact same playbook, which makes Antiochus the perfect historical prototype. Okay, so we've seen the pattern from the past. Now let's move to the next part of the prophecy and see how this all builds toward the future, the beast that is to come. See, his origin isn't random. It's tied to a very specific sequence of world empires. You know how the book of Revelation describes the beast having 7 heads? Well, this interpretation doesn't see them as literal heads, but as symbols for 7 great world empires throughout history that have all, in one way or another, oppressed the nation of Israel. And the sequence here is everything. Think about the timeline from when this was written, right? 5 of these oppressive empires were already ancient history: Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Persia, and Greece. One empire is, and that was the Roman Empire, which was in power at the time, which leaves one more to come, a 7th, final empire, and that is where the beast is prophesied to emerge from. So, where is this 7th empire going to be located? Well, by tracing the historical and geographical footprint of the previous empires, especially Greece and Rome, this interpretation concludes that this final world power is going to be some kind of revived entity that rises out of modern-day Europe. And that brings us to the final act. Once the beast emerges from this future European empire, he begins his ultimate climb to power, and it all culminates in a final decisive conflict. Okay, so the scripture calls the beast an 8th king who is also of the 7, which sounds pretty confusing, right? But the breakdown is actually quite logical if you follow the steps. Step 1, he becomes the leader of that 7th European empire. Step 2, he builds an alliance with 10 other nations.
Once he becomes the head of that entire coalition, he gains this new 8th level of authority. Kind of think of it like a modern EU president, who's the leader of their home country and the leader of the larger union.
And during his reign, his actions are going to be impossible to miss. He's going to use some profound deception to win over the entire world, and then he's going to demand to be worshipped as a god. Anyone who refuses will face brutal persecution. It all builds towards his ultimate goal, a final, direct showdown with the one Revelation calls the Lamb, Jesus Christ.
That final war has a name that I'm sure you've heard before, Armageddon. And according to the prophecy, this is where the beast, his 10-nation alliance, and all their armies meet their absolute, definitive end. So, after all this detail, the prototype, the empires, the final battle, we kind of have to ask, why does any of it even matter? Well, according to this framework, this isn't just some exercise in prophetic curiosity. It has a very, very practical purpose. And here's the main takeaway. The whole purpose of laying out this detailed pattern is to equip people of faith. It's meant to be a guide so that if and when a figure like this actually rises to power, they won't be deceived. They'll be able to recognize him and stay strong. So, let's just do a quick recap of the key identifiers from this interpretation. The beast will 1. Follow the historical pattern of Antiochus IV. 2. Rise out of a European power bloc. 3. Become the head of a 10-nation alliance. And 4. Unleash a fierce persecution of believers. And that leaves us with a final, provocative thought to chew on. If this interpretation is correct, that major prophecies are really just patterns repeating through history, what does that mean for us right now? Maybe we shouldn't be looking for just a single person, but instead, maybe we should be looking for the patterns themselves.